Hey folks, this is Abel James, and thanks so much for joining us on the Fat Burning Man Show, where we talk about real food and real results. How is it possible to shed over 100 pounds and keep it off without exercise? How can we counteract the damaging effects of artificial blue light and non-native EMFs to heal at the cellular level? Why are professional athletes suddenly falling apart in their prime, and what can we do about it? To answer these questions and more, I'm honored to welcome back to the show our friend, Dr. Jack Kruse, a respected neurosurgeon, CEO of the Kruse Longevity Center, author, self-described mitochondriac, and inventor looking at the quantum level to explain how nature works in biology. Dr. Kruse is a fearless seeker, ready to blow the top off the centralized paradigm to uncover the whole truth, and he holds no punches in today's interview, as usual. For the edification of those who don't know him, Dr. Jack Kruse is an incredible, brilliant human being. He's been known to write blog posts butt naked outside in below freezing temperatures, pack himself on ice for hours, and get banned from TED Talks. So this is not a normal man, and that's one of the things I like about him. Back in 2008, Dr. Kruse began experimenting on himself with various protocols, including leptin and cold thermogenesis. As a result, shed an astounding 133 pounds without focusing on exercise. Dr. Kruse is also board certified by the American Board of Neurological Surgery and has completed more than 10,000 surgeries in his career. Jack recently got in touch after dropping one of the most epic, mind-expanding podcast interviews I've ever heard with Dr. Andrew Huberman and Rick Rubin. While part 1 and 2 of those interviews clock in at over 6 hours, I would encourage you to go and take a listen if you've got the time. On a side note, Rick Rubin's new book, The Creative Act, is one of my favorite reads in recent memory. Dr. Jack Kruse offers a lot of protocols and talks a mile a minute in this interview, so I hope you can listen with an open mind. I'll just say that my wife Allison and I, since we met Jack more than 10 years ago, have been incorporating a lot of his protocols into our own lives, and it makes a massive difference to your overall health and the way you can think about health moving forward. But before we get to the interview, if you're looking for a snazzy pair of blue blocking glasses to help mitigate the effects of blue light from phones, tablets, computers, and screens, please take a moment to check out wildrx.com. I wear these after sundown and a lot of times during the day when I'm on the computer as well. And a well-designed pair of blue blockers can really help your sleep quality enormously. And every purchase from wildrx.com helps keep this free show coming your way. We've got a few different frame options. We've got daytime lenses and nighttime lenses. And they're excellent, make a big difference to how you feel and of course how you look. Who doesn't like looking snazzy? So check out wildrx.com if you're interested in a nice quality pair of blue blocking glasses. All right, listen up. In this interview with Dr. Jack Kruse, we're chatting about the truth about how humans can optimize function within the laws of nature. Hint, light, water, and magnetism. How to break free from the centralized paradigm in medicine and its centralized profiteers. A quick history of medical tyranny in the United States. How to use UV light and cold temperatures to access the superhuman pathway. How to harness the power of the sun and melanin to fuel your mitochondria. How to counteract the damaging effects of non-native EMFs. Why using Bluetooth headphones is like microwaving your brain as they destroy precious melanin in the inner ear. Why we should rewild and get outdoors when we're exercising and get some dang sun, and tons more. Dr. Jack's previous interview on the Fat Burning Man Show was the longest ever episode on the podcast at almost an hour and a half long. But this interview you're about to listen to here today completely smashes that record, clocking in at about 2 hours long. So I hope you can listen to it, whether it's in one part or two over the course of time. It's amazing how much information Jack can pack into one conversation. So I hope you enjoy. Also, in the time between recording this interview, hopefully you noticed that I'm a little bit less pale than I was before. I've definitely been out hitting the sun, and Jack loves to rip on me for being too pale and too white, and he's not wrong. So buckle up, ladies and gentlemen. Here is the much anticipated interview with the one and only Dr. Jack Kruse. I hope you enjoy. All right, folks, I'm honored to welcome back to the show today our friend Dr. Jack Kruse. Dr. Kruse is a respected neurosurgeon, CEO of the Kruse Longevity Center, author and inventor looking at quantum at the quantum level to explain how nature works in biology. He's a member of the American Association of Neurological Surgeons, the Congress of Neurologic Surgeons, and the Age Management Medicine Group. Dr. Kruse is a board-certified physician by the American Board of Neurological Surgery and has completed more than 10,000 surgeries in his career. Back in his college days, he was an All-American football and baseball player. And these days, he's fresh off one of the most epic, mind-expanding podcast interviews I've ever heard with Dr. Andrew Huberman and Rick Rubin on Tetragrammaton. Welcome back, Dr. Kruse. What's cooking in Norway?
What's going on, Abel? Long time no speak.
I know, man. It's great to be back in touch, but I'd love to have you start with a little talk about modern medicine and how it lacks a deep understanding of how humans actually function in relation to the natural world.
Well, I mean, the paradigm that's present today that most people just experience. I mean, we just went through this global pandemic that really highlights the problem between centralized medicine and decentralized medicine. Back when you and I first met at the Paleo FX conference, when I was the keynote speaker, I actually opened the door to decentralized medicine and decentralized ideas. And you know, probably better than anybody else, that even though the ancestral health community was pretty open, they didn't really understand what full decentralization really meant. Because it really is about the laws of nature. It's tied to, light, water, and magnetism. And the centralized paradigm is actually tied to the centralized profiteers who make the rules, and then everybody else has to follow the rules. And it turns out the way the paradigm really works, it's about big pharma, their drugs, and then the randomized controlled clinical trial. And if you talk to pretty much anybody with an MD who follows the centralized paradigm, they believe that evidence-based medicine is based on peer review and randomized controlled trials. Then when you casually mention to them that this is a huge problem, as I did in the Huberman podcast, you probably remember when I said to him that there's been no light controls in any RCT, so therefore, how can you assume that anything that you currently believe is accurate without those controls? But now I want to step on it a little further because I think you'll really enjoy this. So for randomized control clinical trials to actually be the gold standard, do you know what that means from a physics standpoint? Like, I'm talking about a decentralized standpoint. It means that cause and effect has to be real. It can't be an illusion. And it turns out the only place that cause and effect can be real is in a Newtonian world where time is absolute. So I know, Abel, that you know about this funny-haired guy from 1905 who was in the Bern office that said, hey, time is relative. In fact, everything is relative. And if time is relative, what did that do to the Newtonian paradigm? It blew it up. But here's the interesting thing. Even though physics accepted what Einstein said in 1905, centralized medicine did not. They still believe the way methodology should be done is cause and effect is real. And we now know that everything in nature is based on probabilities. Well, if you say that to a centralized doctor, to this very day, they are infuriated by this because they think my position is pseudoscience. And you remember this interaction probably at the Paleo FX conference best when Emily Deans, who actually blocked me after you and I last met, when I told her eating a banana in Boston on December 31st in 2011 was actually a way to hurt yourself. And she did not get it. And I know you were there. You heard me say it.
Yeah.
So that's the big issue for me with medicine is that if you're part and a believer of the centralized paradigm, you have to accept things that are just total bull. We now know these things aren't true, but you have to realize what I just told you and your audience, literally less than 0.1% of people know is even true. It's operational even today. The mistake is still being made today.
all over the place, right? And for centralized versus decentralized medicine, centralized medicine kind of has all of the real estate in the space and has pushed out through technological means in a lot of cases, censorship, blocking, kind of like tribalism and all the rest of it to try to just put all of the rest of this stuff out of most people's minds. But when you think about circadian biology, there's a lot to this and there's a lot of history there. Maybe we can go back in time to 1893 and talk about some of the changes that happened for humans and for animals on this planet and why things aren't necessarily getting better as all these people who swear by progress might think.
Yeah, I would tell you that's actually the fundamental key to understanding decentralized medicine. Remember, decentralized means that there's no single controller. So when we talk circadian biology, like I've always done, realize the two parts of the cycle are light and dark. So there's not one, it's not one or the other. It's got to be both. Both are yoked. This is predator, this is prey. And when you understand it from that framework, you begin to see there's no single most important thing. Actually, light from the sun is important as darkness at nighttime is. And if you make a mistake in either side and it becomes unbalanced, for want of a better term, the circadian mechanism is no longer yoked, and that allows destruction to come to cells in terms of how cells are organized. So you probably heard in the Rubin podcast that the organization of cells also is solid state. So I kind of blown that paradigm up. I was never able to really get that far in the paleo community because they effectively try to cancel my message. So I just built my own site and did my own deal to teach people that circadian biology was the key issue. It's not food, it's not exercise. Those things are important, but in the grand scale of things, they're like 6, 7 down on the list. There's a lot of other things that are much more important above it. And, over the last 10 or 12 years, from the last time you and I've talked, when you were big in that community with Rob Wolf and the rest of them, things changed. In fact, the Nobel Prize has been given in that time frame to circadian biology. The last time I checked, I didn't see the paleo diet getting a Nobel Prize.
Right. Well, they don't tend to award that to something that's more of a heuristic, and that's not what you're talking about here.
That's true. No question. But the point still remains that I think that some of the smartest people in the food nutrition space really to bed when they missed the story about light. That really was the big problem that I had. And like I said, you have two choices in life. You can persist to try to bang your head against the wall to try to teach people whose job is to misunderstand you. And that's kind of what happened there. Or you just go and you persist on to continue to teach the people who truly do have a beginner's mindset who want to learn about how decentralized science works. Because let's face it, there's only two decentralized networks in all of nature. One is nature, it's natural. The other one is Bitcoin, and that's financial, built by an algorithm, but it uses the same principles of timing that actually circadian biology does. So when you get right down to it, you make the decision, do I want to be part of the centralized system or the decentralized system? And I think the reason that my message has really gotten a lot of traction over the last probably 2-3 years is because of what happened with COVID. I think COVID really showed people that there is a huge downside to the centralized system. And in fact, that centralized system can be used to not only harm you, but actually can be used to cancel you and, affect your job, affect your health, affect the decisions that you really should be making for you as the CEO of yourself.
So what was it that happened around the turn of the century that started to affect human health so much? Talking about electricity and the different forms of AC and DC specifically.
Well, the number one thing, and I know you know this, was really the electric power wars and the wars that started the electric power wars between Westinghouse, Tesla, Thomas Alva Edison and how the teams were all formed. And Edison was the big DC guy. He was backed by JP Morgan. Tesla, who worked with Edison at one time, but then he left when he showed his design of the AC power motor to Edison, and Edison said this was too dangerous because of the voltages involved. And they went their separate ways, and Westinghouse joined with Tesla. Obviously, the story came to a fighting head in 1893 in Chicago and Paris when the World's Fair was basically electrified. And it turned out that Westinghouse and Edison won the war because they showed that they could do it. And then JP Morgan completely changed the channel by using the centralized financial system to bankrupt Westinghouse and steal all the patents of Tesla. And what did he do? He formed General Electric, which basically took over and used Tesla's work, to electrify the surface of the earth so that we could start to plug everything into it. And that fueled the change from the the agricultural revolution, probably to the industrial revolution, which really fully developed, since that time. So 1879 is when the light bulb was innovated, but the power grid in 1893 is the real seminal event that most humans have to realize. That's when we became uncoupled from the light and dark cycle.
And then all of a sudden we start seeing obesity become a problem. We see Alzheimer's and autism as a population kind of for the first time. And especially if you look at the data more recently over the course of time, it's ugly. Things are not progressing like many people say that they are, especially when we look at human health.
Yeah, well, it's interesting that you bring up those. I mean, I always like when I do a podcast to give people a little bit of history. The first paper on Alzheimer's was written in 1901, so only 7 years after this. And then the first paper on autism is 1940. And if you think about what was happening in the world at those time and how, really communications from the world wars, both of them really ramped up the use of both wireless and light, you begin to see how the Neolithic diseases link, to the changes in how we use light. And most people think when I say light, they think it's just the light that we put on in the environment. It turns out the light that we use to communicate is as deadly as the light that we use to illuminate for refraction. And part of the reason for that is because it turns out that the non-visual system of mammals is built in a very specific way that's affected by all these formats of light. And that's kind of what I started to get into, with Huberman. I mean, that's the real reason Rick invited me on the podcast, to try to educate Huberman on the basics of what he really didn't know about light. And, I had hoped to do that through the paleo community, like when I first met you 11, 12 years ago, so that people would understand that food fundamentally is a story of photosynthesis. That's part of the reason why when I mentioned Emily Deans earlier, the fact that I got laughed about that, still to this day, is a stunning revelation that nobody in the paleo community really understood, that all food webs linked back to photosynthesis. I still find that one thing shocking. But nonetheless, it's history, it's over with. And I actually had to do a podcast. It wasn't actually a podcast, it was a talk in Vermont for the Weston A. Price Foundation, where actually it's on YouTube now, where I actually made the case that food is an electromagnetic barcode of photosynthesis. So I think once that got put out there and then people saw that perspective, that allowed them to assimilate some of the message. And then the same thing that happened at that time is actually when the Nobel Prize was given for circadian biology. And I think that's when things began to really change.
So let's talk a little bit more about the different forms of light, because like you said, when many people hear that word, they're thinking, are we talking about the sun? Are we talking about screens? How deep does this go and how much does it affect?
Well, the sun is obviously the light that we evolved with. It's the light that all the photoreceptors that you know about, like we're talking rods and cones. Remember, rods and cones are really just a story of refraction and how we see. Most people believe that those photoreceptors are the most important. It turns out in biology, they're not. And actually, that's the story that I'm unfolding. So let's talk about the opsins, because the opsins are the ones that we talked about with Rick and Huberman. We have encephalopsin, we have neuropsin, we have melanopsin, we have rhodopsin. Those are the opsins that people know about. What they don't know is how they control the different things in mammals that control your coats, your skin, even your lipid type. For example, one of the things that stunned, I think, Huberman is when I told him the number one non-visual photoreceptor in humans is cholesterol. And the real difference, like the decentralized mindset for cholesterol, is radically different than you're going to hear from the centralized guys who are the lipidologists. LDL cholesterol is bad for one reason. It doesn't have electrons in it. So that means it's the winner type of cholesterol. HDL cholesterol has more electrons in it, so that means you can absorb more light. So mammals have to have a plan to change their cell membranes between seasons. So most people who live in a farm, and I know you've been on farms, you know this, cows and horses look different between fall or winter and summer and spring, but no one's actually really sat down, in the health space and said, okay, how does this process really happen? Well, believe it or not, what controls it is all these non-visual photoreceptor changes. And if you happen to live in a disruptive environment, those processes don't happen properly. So, for example, the simple low-hanging fruit for people to get is everybody knows that when your vitamin D, you're not in the sun enough, is not made, your LDL cholesterol tends to go up. And no one has put two and two together yet. Well, yeah, LDL cholesterol makes vitamin D, but there's a bigger story there. The story is not only is that a sign that you're light mismatch, but immediately you also need to know that LDL cholesterol plus T3 and vitamin A equals pregnenolone. So it turns out when LDL cholesterol is up, that tells you the animal is also light stressed. And this is exactly how this system begins to work. So when you have a bunch of centralized doctors sit down at a meeting and start talking to you about, your hormone panel, this and that, but they don't have this fundamental idea that it's not the boxcars of biochemistry that you learn. Like you used to hear Matt Lalonde and Rob Wolf talk about this, or Chris Masterjohn in the WAP world. What I was basically trying to get them, all three of them, to understand is that light controls the boxcars of biochemistry. In other words, how to do the things that it does. That's the missing link. So I used an analogy that I think you'll like, because I know you're a big music guy. I said, if you have the boxcar biochemistry mindset, it's equivalent to you going to buy Prince's guitar, okay, and thinking because you own the guitar that you can play like Prince. It's ridiculous. And the thing is, I think the idea, at least for those guys, was so foreign because they truly believe that it's really all about biochemistry. And it's not. When I kept showing them over and over and over again what they were missing, it's almost like they couldn't fathom it. And, in the Huberman podcast, you probably remember when we started to talk about melanopsin. Remember, Dr. Huberman uses the cephalopod in his lab because, he's got a joint appointment in ophthalmology and neurosurgery. And I told him in the podcast, I said, realize that the cephalopod brain is really human brain 1.0, and that our brain is 1,150,000. And when he made the comment that Dr. Burson, who's one of his friends, found that we have amphibian opsin called melanopsin in our brain, everybody couldn't believe that in 2002. And I kind of chuckled during the podcast. And I'm like, do you guys not realize that mammals came from amphibians and fish? Like, it's almost like that basic concept was actually lost. And the reason why this is important for people to understand, why I want people to get it, is these systems are ancient. They are ancient in us. They are ancient in all life forms. Most people don't even know that the cephalopods that Rubin studies, they came on Earth around 590 million years ago. That's literally about 50 million years after the Cambrian explosion. So these are ancient animals. So realize this story of the non-visual photoreceptors, meaning the opsins, this goes back to the genesis of when life became very complex after the Cambrian explosion. We're not talking about, the first two domains of life. Now we're talking about the eukaryotes, and when all of a sudden 32 phyla showed up overnight, 650 million years ago. And it turns out that the opsins have this weak covalent bond between them and vitamin A. And that brings the other story. You start to go, okay, why is vitamin A important in this story? It turns out it's a quantum mechanical action. And when vitamin A is liberated and not controlled properly by the circadian system, vitamin A becomes a wrecking ball. It destroys all photoreceptors, but it also destroys the non-visual photoreceptors. So, for example, between the time you and I have talked last, we now know that vitamin B12 is a human photoreceptor. Most people today in the community that you and I used to play in still don't know that's true. So if, given what I just told you, you understand that vitamin A liberated from, say, blue light, or putting a microphone in your ear when you play some music disrupts that. Like one of the big things that's happening now is everybody's wearing these, Apple pods in their ears, but none of them really know that their cochlea is lined with melanin, and they have no idea that they're destroying this. So they wonder why they're all getting tinnitus, or why they're getting these new conditions out there like misanthropia, where they have almost hearing or auditory hallucinations. This is coming from the breakdown of the non-visual photoreceptors. Like, we are seeing evolution happen as we use technology differently than we have before. It's no different than the story that you started this podcast with. Say, Jack, let's go back to 1893. Okay, well, now I want you to remember 2021, when people started putting these stupid freaking things in their ears and thinking that there's no problem with it. I mean, realize when you put one in your ear and one in this ear, the microwaves are going right through your brain. And for you to think that there's no problem with this, it's equivalent, say, for me to tell you 11 years ago when we first met, hey, Abel, I'd love for you to stick your head in the microwave oven. You would have said that's preposterous. But guess what? All the people, and even some of the people that I guarantee that you make music with now, I mean, you think about electric guitars, you think about like the people who've killed themselves, the Kurt Cobains, the Michael Jacksons, the Benningfields, all the people in music, all of a sudden their stories begin to make a lot more sense. In other words, if you just have the what I like to call the boxcar mentality, you can't explain why all of a sudden somebody who can be uber talented from the time they're 5 years old to about 30 and then fall apart in front of all of our eyes, and get all kinds of weird problems, and not have at least some curiosity to say, how did this happen?
And it's par for the course. It's not the exception that happens. It seems like that's the traditional path of, especially the more famous and successful, in air quotes, you are, especially if you get famous as a young person, like Michael Jackson, say, then things start to break down over the course of time. But usually, yeah, somewhere in the 30s, maybe the 40s, certainly by 50, if they make it past 27, that is.
It's, I just look at it like this. When I think about 1984 to right now, I think about like Prince, I think about Michael Jackson, I think about all the different artists, and to think about how successful they were in the beginning and how they've fallen apart. It's actually the story of what we're seeing in kids now. We're seeing kids in Asia now, 96% of them have myopia. No one seems to want to discuss why. We have kids now between 12 and 15 years old killing themselves like this. But that never happened before. Now we see kids who, want to change the color of their hair. They want to do things their parents didn't do. Girls want to be boys and boys want to be girls. Many of the things that you saw start, like from Def Leppard on, the androgyny that was novel back then, all that's happened is the needle has gotten further and further and further. And Abel, here's the thing that people don't understand. Vitamin A controls sexual dimorphism in mammals. So when you begin to realize that we use technology that breaks the vitamin A off, and then the non-visual photoreceptors just get destroyed, and you realize that cell signaling within the human brain is just like what Huberman said. It's like a light show that you can see in the cephalopod. In the human brain, the same thing's going on. The difference is when I open the head up, you don't see the light show. Why? Because evolution has hidden the light show, because the solid state physics that's used in the brain is much more, I don't want to say competent, but it's much more complex than it was in the cephalopod brain. But I don't want anybody to think who listens to this that these things can't be explained. It really frustrates me to the nth degree for us as, interested mammals or interesting clinicians to look at the world events going on around us and not be able to sit down and have the discussion. Why is it, that the world is changing around us the way it is? Is there a path that we're missing? And I guess the point that I want to make probably to you and your audience, probably more to you, because you were there in the beginning when I started to try to unleash this path in a group of people who I thought were ready for it. That was a huge miscalculation for me. I'll be the first one to admit it. But here we are now, 11, 12 years later. You're an older guy, and you've seen it. You've actually experienced it yourself. And it's got to make people curious. Why is this kind of stuff going on? Because then you can layer it on and say, okay, is this the reason why really the French paradox really existed? Is this the reason why, we've got the problem with the 7 country studies that we always used to argue about in paleo times? The reason why is it's a latitude-based flawed study. It goes back to the story that I mentioned to you earlier and to Huberman on the podcast about you don't have light controls. Sometimes you start to blame food for things that light causes. And that's exactly what's happened over the last 150 years. Now, I'm not going to tell you there's not certain things about food science that have totally, things up, to be honest with you, like seed oils and things like that. But the seed oil guys that are out on Twitter now, none of them seem to realize the real problem with seed oils is that you've lost the QA program of photosynthesis, that it's really a deuterium story. Actually, it's an isotope of hydrogen. And then we get back to, that's a quantum mechanical issue. And of course, that's when they want to stop, because they don't know anything about the quantum mechanics between H plus and deuterium. They don't understand how light works with a difference. And they certainly don't want to have a discussion about Einstein's E equals mc squared, because that's actually the reason why deuterium is bad. And it's the reason why photosynthesis has favored H plus. It's why we have all those stupid little enzymatic steps in the glycolytic pathway, in the gluconeogenic pathway, because nature is telling us, I want this version of hydrogen. I don't want the other one, because when I get the other one, we get problems. And the problems are dictated by those decentralized laws of nature. The one that Feynman warned us about and said, nature is absurd, and it's your job to understand she is absurd. And don't try to come up with some kind of half-truth bullshit biochemistry story about why she's not absurd. And all I want people to do, I don't really want people to believe what I'm telling you. all I want you to do is examine what I'm saying. I want you to be like the guy who sat maybe next to Emily Deans and say, I never thought about eating a banana out of season and what the effects of that potentially could be on my mitochondria. In fact, I've never heard anybody actually mention that before. And this is the reason why I told people at that talk long ago. It's the mark of an educated mind to take something you fundamentally do not know and examine it for yourself and decide, is this something that I should pay attention to or not? And you were there during that keynote speech. You heard what I said. I spoke from the heart that I was sick and tired of being fed up with medicine back then. So you can only imagine how I feel now after COVID. I mean,
Right.
It's like crazy.
Yeah. And so you're talking about mismatches, and maybe you could talk about Rick Rubin a little bit and how you worked with him and changed his habits, but talking about the way that many musicians live their lives out of necessity, because you have to pay the bills, even if you do pursue the arts. The way that I was doing it was like many other musicians. Basically, you are active at night and you are sleeping for a lot of the day. And that's most days, if not all of the days. That's just how you're set up. That's when the shows are. That's when you got to travel. That's when you got to pack up your gear and go home, what have you. So Rick Rubin, at some point, his health began to degrade from this. And as an intervention, you had him do something that many people would love to do, walk on the beach, out in the sun. Why would that work with our biology better than what most people who are performers actually do for their careers?
Well, I mean, this goes directly to the whole point of the podcast. I mean, there's a lot to unpack there, but let's talk about what destroyed Rick. Because I actually believe in order for you to understand this, you have to understand how things fall apart to see how they come together. So Rick, at that time, was 400 pounds. He was a vegan. He wore sunglasses at night. Okay. He did everything possible that you could do wrong. Okay. So for him, you heard even in the podcast, he's not interested in learning the science. He's a mammal that says, just tell me what to do and I will do it. And he will continue to pay attention to you more if he continues to get more right, more right, more right. So what did he do? First thing is he changed the way he worked. That's actually what I did. I stopped operating as much at night and started to doing stuff during the day. So the first thing, with him being a music guy, he's like, okay, we're going to change the way we do recording. Then he took the sunglasses off. Then he said, okay, I'm going to start eating animal proteins because I'm beginning to understand that my circadian clock needs this DHA for some reason. Jack's talked about it. I don't want to get into it. I know it has to do with Einstein, but I'm just going to eat oysters because Jack told me oysters is the key. So he did that. The big thing is, he lived, he's originally from New York City, but he lived in California, in Malibu, where Shangri-La is. And I told him, I said, this place is toxic for you. You need to get out. So he picked up and he went to Hawaii. And then he found out Hawaii wasn't even good enough. He had to go someplace better. So he went someplace even better, further south. And what happened with Rick slowly over time is he basically learned that circadian biology was the single most important thing. And the two things in circadian biology that matter the most is light and dark, but also temperature. And you remember when you and I first met, I talked to people a lot about the cold thermogenesis stuff. I started talking about cold before Wim Hof, before Cool Sculpting was out. I mean, my papers were written in 2005. Cool Sculpting didn't get patents until 2008. Nobody even knew who the hell Wim Hof was back at those times.
Right.
But I could care less about attribution. What I cared about is changing medicine. And that's still the point to this very day. I only care that people understand how cold works. So you remember some of the original stuff that I wrote back in the CT series that blew people's minds. It's part of the reason why they invited me to the keynote speaker address, when I basically said, all mammals use the mammalian dive reflex. And the reason why is they're in water, in their mothers, and we're born that way. And we're paying attention to temperature sensation all over our bodies. You think about some of the stuff that we just talked about in the beginning of the podcast about the non-visual photoreceptors. The reason mammals change their exterior coats has to do with temperature and light changes. And that, in effect, nature was signaling to me that this was all about the circadian mechanism, because that's actually what the circadian mechanism pays attention to. And that is, for want of a better term, I want to keep this musical because of you and also Rick. That's the conductor that tells all the boxcars what to do. Okay? Just like Rick takes all the information that he gets in Shangri-La and he puts it together for Adele, or he puts it together for Metallica, or he puts it together from one of the rappers or the hip hop guys that he works with. And he makes that sound better than what it was before. In other words, it was still good, but he knew that it can be better. He's trying to extract the value out of that sound for the artist. And what circadian biology is doing for us, Abel, is extracting the value out of light and temperature to get the value out of us. And what you heard in the Rubin Huberman podcast is something that probably stunned a lot of people. That the value you're looking for is you're looking to create light that's stronger than the sun makes. And that was the stunning revelation that caught everybody by surprise. But I think people forget when they go back and look at the blogs that I wrote 15 years ago. It's called the leptin melanocortin pathway. That was what that ancient CT6 blog was all about. You know what the problem was back then, even, Abel? That even the people that were in the paleo community who told you they were science forward, they weren't as science forward as they should have been. Because nobody asked me about melanin back then, but everybody asked me about leptin. And you remember the story, the keynote speech, how I told you I came upon this story from Big Pharma, how they tried to bury it. And what did I say? My goal wasn't really to bury Big Pharma back then. My goal was, I was a 40-year-old doctor at that time. And I'm like, this really stunned me. Like this went against everything that I fundamentally believe. And I said, I need to understand how this hormone works in the brain. I mean, after all, I'm a brain surgeon. This hormone is in the hypothalamus. This is an area that I'm an expert in. And I realized, how can I be an expert when I don't know about this physiology? I mean, that's really, I'd love to tell you, I can put it any other way, but I realized I didn't know as much as I should have known. So what did I do? I did what any, I think, wise person would do, is I went back to the library and started to learn about these things. And guess what? The things that I found out is what I just told you. The value was in light. The value was in temperature. Then I had to go back and look at all the things that I learned. And then I realized what was the purpose of the circumventricular organs. What was the purpose of putting melanin around the mitochondria? What was the purpose of why people who had tightly coupled haplotypes, meaning African Americans, was inside the 20s? And why guys like me and you, like my people, you've met me, I'm tan now, but I'm built as an exterior for the 59th latitude. And to know that the system is adaptable, even if your engines and your surfaces are mismatched. Why? Because guess what? All mammals have the same system in them. That's part of the reason why I wrote those blogs, the Holy Trinity blog and the Cold Thermogenesis 6 protocol. I'm like, all mammals work the same way. So when you sit down and unpack that, that's 300 million years, Abel. And you remember when you and I met, everybody was infatuated with the 10,000-year history of Boyd Eaton and Lorne Cordain and what Rob brought to the table. And I what did I say? That's a step in the right direction, But boys and girls, we need to go way further back. Like this story, we need to go back all the way to the Cambrian explosion. And, what did I write in my book after that paleo talk? Mark Sisson hired me to write a book. I wrote it and he didn't like it. And the reason he didn't like it is because it wasn't enough about food and exercise. And he said, Jack, how about we just walk away from each other? I said, perfect. Because I realized right then and there, that wasn't my tribe. I believe that your tribe vibes with this and they're willing to adapt. You happen to be one of the guys that I met at that event. I knew implicitly, like you, Erwin LaCour, some of the others. I knew some of the others just weren't open enough. They had a business model set up for food and exercise, and they weren't breaking that for anything. And I was like, I just need to find people who really want to know the truth. And yeah, the truth is this is not an easy thing, Abel. It's not something that I can break out in a couple of tweets or an Instagram post or even doing, a couple of podcasts here and there. And, you have a unique viewpoint of Jack Kruse, probably compared to anybody who's ever done a podcast with me. Why? Because you saw the speech, you saw what happened at that time, you saw what developed. And then you also lived the story yourself. You actually did your own thing. You started using light a different way. You have a very unique input here. You also saw how things develop. And to me, the fact that we're back 12 years doing this again and talking about how those chapters unfolded, the story was there the day of that keynote speech.
Yeah.
But the problem was nobody was ready for the message.
Right.
It's kind of like when you write a song. I'll give you another analogy because I've said this to Rick many times. It's kind of like Led Zeppelin. When they wrote Led Zeppelin 4, they decided to go to an old crickety house, okay? They were completely connected to nature. Latitude, but totally grounded, freezing cold. They set up in the weirdest places, and they played, and guess what? First time, they did almost the whole album. There was no working on this. It just all came out. And when people hear that story, they think that, oh, Led Zeppelin was amazing. And I don't. I think the reason why is because they were tied to the light cycle. They were completely grounded. All of them had relatively young heteroplasmy. It would make total sense why the human instrument would play magnificent music. Why? It's the same story of the Stradivarius. The Stradivarius is millions of dollars. Why? Because the last time we had the Maunder minimum from the sun, that wood is denser and therefore it sounds better. It's no different than the Led Zeppelin story that's out there. But here's the funny part, Abel. It takes you, the human mammal, to see that story. In other words, you're a music guy. You're a carnivore guy. You're a paleo guy. You need to see how the music story resonates through this. You need to see how it goes back to light. And then when you find out that every single sense in humans has melanin between it and the environment, that should stun you. You should go, wait a minute, let me get this straight. We actually have to use light to hear. How crazy is that? And remember what I told you about Feynman. She said, nature is absurd. So when you think about the story I'm unfolding, there is nothing that's Occam's razor about biology. I said this to Richard Nicolay a long time ago before he started making fun of me. I said, tell me what is parsimonious about the photoelectric effect, because then I'll suck SpaghettiOs out of your ass with a straw. I mean, you're supposed to be free the animal guy. Dude, you are as conventional wisdom as anybody could be, because you actually think it is Occam's razor. Things should be parsimonious. There's nothing about nature that's parsimony. She is out to hide her recipes from us, like the most incredible chameleon you can imagine. And it's our job to figure out what the recipe is. And you have to use your talents. You're a talented musician. I want you, just like Rick did. Remember, Rick doesn't care about science. He's a music guy. But he was able to understand that he needed to improve his collection of charge from the sun via melanin. And remember, he's a white boy just like I am. He's built, for a high latitude as well. He's a Northern European guy with an uncoupled haplotype. The story here is great because what are we showing you? That you can fix yourself. Like, even if you do all the wrong things, like, do I believe fundamentally that if Michael Jackson or Prince would have known some of the stuff that I've been talking about over the last 10 years, would have listened to the Rubin Huberman podcast and the implications of it, I could have explained most of the things that they struggled with. Now, they would have had to change the situation. Why? Because much like the Titanic, they were the people on that boat. They had to get in the lifeboat, or they had to jump into cold water to get in the lifeboat and make extraordinary decisions around their life. In other words, to fix their problems. You may not have to do that, Abel. The fact that, you moved to Colorado and now you're back in Austin. I hope that maybe even some of the stuff we're talking about today and some of the things I said to you 11 years ago, and maybe some of the things you heard in the podcast resonates with you. And so, if I'm going to continue doing what I'm doing, maybe I need to do the same thing Rick's doing. I need, like, I'm looking at you right now, and don't get mad at me when I say this. Dude, you're too white. You need to get in the sun. And the thing is, your music, you have the same fundamental problem that I had as a neurosurgeon, that most people do stuff at the wrong time of the day for your business and my business. And that's a problem. It's something that I have constantly struggled with. I would love to tell you that I'm as optimum as I should be, but my problem is I have an addiction to doing neurosurgery. I love doing my job, but I also know that my job is harmful to my N equals 1. I get it loud and clear. So there comes a point where I'm going to have to make the same decision you are. You obviously are a lot younger than I am, but guess what? You're a lot older than you were the last time I saw you. That means your heteroplasmy rate is catching up to you. You're finding that Father Time is still undefeated. None of us are getting out of here alive, bro. None of us. But I will tell you that some of the things about circadian biology, some of the things that I write about, some of the things I talk about, death is the slowest form of time we create. Or I should say, maybe the other way around. It was really bad. Death is the slowest form of health we create. And we need to think about that. We need to think about the organization of cells. We need to think about how melanin works with mitochondria, and really fundamentally why Rick was able to do the things that he was able to do. And then, when you heard the story about him having to have this massive surgery after he's already fixed himself, but remember, that damage was present when he was a young man, but made far worse by the things that he was doing in the music business. And what did I do? I actually just told him, I said, look, the single most important sheet of melanin that is going to keep you a national treasure is the stuff in your cochlea. And I knew that if I could get him on, methylene blue when he was on pump, that we would keep the most unbelievable master tapes in the world fully functioning, no matter if he lost it in other places, so that he'd still be able to do the things he can do. And hopefully, he's helping other people in his industry become, Rick Rubin 2.0 or Rick Rubin 3.0 or 4.0, whomever is going to be the next, Rick Rubin. And I feel the same way, about Huberman. I think that's part of the reason why Rick wanted me to come out to Malibu and talk to you, Rubin, because Rick knows that I'm pretty passionate about getting doctors the story that I'm sharing with you right now. Why? I want to see. I don't want to die with this knowledge. I feel like if somebody was to die with this knowledge, it's kind of like burning of the Library of Alexandria. It's just terrible. And the thing is, there's so much data out there that is pointing to light, water, and magnetism, and that the decentralized network of medicine needs to grow. If I'm that guy that basically cut the path for the future guys to come, I'm fine with that. I'm perfectly okay with that.
You're definitely at least that, yeah.
Well, I want people to understand that when you've got to fight the centralized paradigm that's in power now, I mean, I've had to do this for the last 20 years. I did it not only with centralized medicine, I did it with my own specialty. I've waged war against them. I've waged war against the hospitals, big pharma. I've waged war against, the paleo guys, against the carnivore guys. I want people to stop believing half-truths. I want people to know half-truths always lead us to full lies when you understand the fabric of how nature works. And most of her stuff is so hidden. It's so absurd when you really break it down. That's why I think so many people were stunned with the story of Melanin. And I have to be honest with you, Abel. For me, I told my nurse this last night. This is like old hat for me. This was not stunning. For me, this is like talking about something that I worked on 20 years ago. And I think now people are just beginning to wake up about the implications of actually what this stuff means and how really important it is. And I guess on that part, that's part of the reason why Chantel had to twist my arm for 6 weeks to answer Rick, to come out. Because the last time I did all this, Abel, I had the CIA, the FBI, DARPA, all kinds of people that I really didn't want, in my life at that time, so to speak. And I felt like doing that podcast was an invitation back, to going through that shit all over again.
Sure.
And having, state medical boards come after me and everything else. Why? Because most people these days understand what canceling someone is on social media or a doctor. Why? Because you guys all got a chance to see it, happen before your eyes the last 2 or 3 years. And it turned out that all the guys that people were making fun of were right.
Right.
I even did a documentary with some of those people about the vaccine before it came out. Me, Malone, McCullough. That was done 3 years ago before anybody knew this. I'm like, look, dude. But the problem is all that stuff had to be behind a paywall, because if it wasn't, they would have come after us just like they went after everybody else. If you don't think the architects of this centralized response, like Fauci and this Hotez guy down by you in Baylor, these guys are, I said this in the Bitcoin community, that the people in Washington, D.C. right now are worse than what King George was in 1774. That's actually how I feel.
Yeah.
I wouldn't piss on these guys in Washington, D.C. right now if they were on fire. Why? Because I think they're bigger despots than the royal family was back then. And if you think about what happened back then, that was about religious freedom. It was about taxation. You think about what it is now. I mean, you probably know this story because I know you're a little bit of a historian, but Benjamin Rush was one of the founding fathers, and he wanted to put in the Constitution the issue about medical tyranny. That's where Rush Medical School comes from in Chicago. But he was overruled by Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson said, I don't believe that this is important enough to put in the documents. Lo and behold, 250 years later, Thomas Jefferson was wrong. Benjamin Rush was right. And Benjamin Rush would have probably put a bullet in Fauci. I mean, if you go back and read the things that Rush wrote about, he basically said if the British government can do this over money and over God, he goes, can you imagine what they're going to do when it comes to your health? And this guy was brilliant. And we as a country, I think, need to realize it's okay to get punched in the mouth once by the government, but we all need to come together, whether it's left, right, middle, independent, doesn't matter what it is. Nobody should tell you what to do when it comes to your health. No one. Okay? That's not the government's job. It's your job. It's what Abel does on his podcast. He's like, look, I want you to do this. I want you to do that. You know, or same with me. I'm going to lead people to a path that I think will help them. Ultimately, people are going to vote on Abel. They're going to vote on Jack by if they are if we're popular. Do they want to listen to us? Do they want to buy that, you know, that we sell to them? And for me, it's information. For you, I don't know what, you know, you're doing anymore. But
Still trying to figure that out.
the key is I want people to understand that that's what decentralization is. It's about freedom. It's about liberty. It's about the pursuit of not only happiness, but also health. And we all need to come together on that issue. That's the real reason decentralization is important.
It's following bigger laws than the ones that are currently in the books, which are being broken themselves.
It's true. Look, I'm going through it's you would probably find this kind of interesting. I'm going through the same thing right now that I did with the paleo community, with the Bitcoin community. I'm actually teaching them. I always say this to them. I said, you guys were smart that you got into Bitcoin really early. So you're all financially well-to-do and well-off. I said, but all of you are still centralized in your biology. So you're effectively Steve Jobs. You're going to be 56 years old, the billionaire, and you're going to be dead. I said, can you think about a worse legacy than Steve Jobs to have that much money? And I said, and get this, his buddy that he's always linked with at Microsoft, Paul Allen's also dead. The other guy, who's the architect of doom, who's continuing to do that, took his money and is now trying to centralize biology further. That's our friend Bill Gates, you know, through vaccines. But the big one that I'm concerned about is he wants to block the sun.
Right.
I mean, think about that kind of bullshit, dude.
Oh my God. This is why we need you, Jack.
Well, I look at it like this. When people understand that the sun, like Rick likes to call it, the source code on Earth, I want everybody to know that the sun really is the power generator that you need to pay attention to. Melanin is how you collect that charge. That's not the only part of the story, because if you stay out all day, but you party like a rock star all night and, you know, play music and this and that, you're going to wind up with a problem. And I don't want to see that happen to people. I want people to know that follow the 80-20 rule. Do as much as you can during the day, but you need to do as much as you can at night so that you stay away from my profession. I do not want people to go through the sausage grinder that they have to go through. And why? It's things that you may not realize from the last time you and I talked. I'm now starting to see kids 20 years old with diseases that used to show up in people who were 40, 50, 60, 70 years old. You know, carotid disease, suicide, Alzheimer's. I've seen Alzheimer's disease now in someone who is below 30 years old.
Really?
I would have never predicted that, but it was an IT professional who used to wear those things. I saw the second person with Parkinson's disease who worked in a Starbucks with that thing on their head for about 12 years. So I want people to know that you need to pay attention to these things. It's okay for you not to want to believe Uncle Jack. I'm fine with that. I will direct you to multiple books, because when I first met Abel, I couldn't send him to any of those books because they weren't written yet. I was writing the blogs about them. Now there's books about this written by, well-to-do scientists that you all would know. And when you see it for your own two eyes, you'll go.
So what is it specifically about the AirPods and the earbuds? Is it the Bluetooth and the fact that there are two of them? And why don't people realize? And I don't wear these. I did a few years ago a little bit, and I felt like something was off and it wasn't quite right. But I didn't notice that it was immediately damaging in an obvious way. So how does that work with us? Because we're not optimal when we have those in, pumping their juices out through our brains. But
Well, the effect is like anything else. It's multifactorial, but I'll give you the basics. The first thing is realize that they work on a frequency that's 2.5 billion cycles per second. So I just want you to remember the Schumann resonance on Earth is 7.83 hertz. So if you put those two together, and this is something else that I don't think you probably know. I just recently wrote a blog called Quantum Engineering 47 and 48. The blog is exactly the same. One is for the visual learner. The other one is for the science geek. But basically, I just described the FM antenna that's built into your brain. You actually really have an FM antenna. It works exactly the same way as an FM station in Austin. Turns out, two arms of the antenna, one is the SCN, the other one is the size and shape of your ventricle system in your brain, okay? So I lay all the science out, so you can see it. So realize what I just told you. You put one here and one here, you're basically in between, right in between the antenna system. So you probably are too young to remember, but I guarantee if you ask your mom or dad, when they used to drive in their car underneath the power line and they had an AM station on, what happened? It would sound all fuzzy and this and that, what we call white noise. It's the exact same thing as when you put those things in your head. So that means you lose the ability to tell where the Earth is in relation to the sun. That's what the FM station is built to do in your own head. That's where the alpha wave comes from. Why? Because what's the brain tissue that's right around the ventricular system? It's called the thalamus. The thalamus is where the alpha wave comes from. The alpha wave is designed to be 7.83 hertz, which is exactly what the Schumann resonance of the Earth is. And how does the Schumann resonance the Earth? Complex, but very quickly, cathode ray of the sun hits the magnetosphere. Magnetosphere absorbs all the energy, then shoots electric storms down to the Earth. The electric storms down to the Earth create an effect, much like you do when you play your acoustic guitar. So the cavity between the magnetosphere and the surface of the Earth is like the inside of your guitar. And that's designed to be 7.83 hertz. All life forms have to deal with that. That's the reason why the alpha wave in every single brain on this planet resonates at 7.83 hertz. So this is the basic antenna system that everything alive uses. So when you put something in between it, that's the first problem. Second problem is what I told you before. Your cochlea, which looks like a seashell, has a huge sheet of melanin in it. So when you introduce non-native EMF, what does it do to your mitochondria and your biology? First thing it does, it dehydrates you. So let's make sense of this. Abel has had the opportunity to go on a plane, right? And be in the plane with 250 other idiots who are all using Wi-Fi, right? The plane's made out of metal. So effectively, you basically are the piece of steak. Remember, the piece of steak I'm talking about is when you used to heat up that steak from coming home from a gig and you forgot to wrap it in wet paper towel, the steak tastes like shoe leather. You've had the experience that it dehydrates you. What you forget is that you are also a piece of steak, except you're alive. And your mitochondria makes water. Why? Because it reverses the process of photosynthesis. Photosynthesis consumes water. We make it. That's actually the point that I was trying to make to Emily Deans a really long time ago before she laughed at me. So here you see the boomerang coming back, hitting her right in the ass. So if you don't make enough water, you get dehydrated. Do you think the FM radio station in your head's going to work the same way? Remember, I told you, it's filled with CSF. CSF comes from where? Water. Where? In your blood. 93% of your blood is water. 99.7% of the CSF in that ventricular system is actually an ultrafiltrate of your blood. So all of a sudden you start going, this is now beginning to make some sense. But what happens what's the other effect with non-native EMF? It degrades melanin. So that's when you have to look at all the slides. And I don't know if you've seen my slides that I've done from probably 15 to now. I like to use this guy Alexander Wunsch's slide because he always shows you when you put tyrosine phenylalanine on one side and it goes to melanin, noradrenaline, dopamine, all the basic neurotransmitters are made in your frontal lobes. Melanin can be degraded into those things. So people who are creative, this is something that Rick learned and he really liked. Creativity in humans actually isn't a positive evolutionary effect. It's actually a negative effect. Why? Because you degrade melanin to make dopamine. Creativity is a side effect of a lower dopamine. So everybody knows that mental disorders, especially like depression, is tied to low dopamine. What a lot of people don't know is that high dopamine released chaotically is what schizophrenia is. Now, Rick's book on creativity is about all the things in between there. Those are the people that Rick deals with. So when I sit down with people, especially someone like you who's a creative, and I explain to you, what I just said to you may sound offensive, that basically I'm saying Abel has more in common with people who have mental disorder. And that's truly what creativity is. It's actually a mental disorder because you've degraded melanin. I'm going to prove to you that there's something that you learned as a little boy that actually shows this effect, but you never realized it until I tell it to you. When did cave paintings show up in human history? When humans began to live where? In caves. Let me ask you a question, Abel. Is there any light in caves?
Generally not.
There's fire, right?
Sure.
But yet, that's when humans decided to start writing that stuff on the wall. And did that happen after the Neanderthals went extinct? It absolutely did. So right then and there, you begin to realize that the hominins that were actually much more advanced than us, people don't realize Neanderthals had 125 more grams of brain than we did. Hence the reason why Cro-Magnon man had that big, huge skull. But you'll also notice that you don't find any of those people above about the 40th latitude in terms of bones. Why? Because it turned out they needed to have much higher levels of light to maintain the Ferrari engine in the head. So why did hominids take over? Because they are not as advanced. In other words, there was a cognitive de-evolution that did occur. And that cognitive de-evolution actually made us the more creative, silly talking monkey. And we started to live inside in caves where there was less light, and we put artificial light at that time called fire, which actually created the system. And guess what? We have continued on that path ever since. Like, this story isn't 1893, my friend. Now you're beginning to understand maybe some of the crazy wisdom that I really had in my head when you first met me that nobody was ready for. Why I told you Lauren Cordain and Boyd Eaton are literally, their 10,000, 14,000 year look back, not good enough. Totally not good enough to put this in the true evolutionary framework that it needs to be understood. And when you see this for yourself and you examine it, you have a duty to say, okay, now I'm beginning to understand why Jack said these iPads and these iPods and these earbuds and all this stuff is a problem. Maybe now I'm beginning to understand why Prince made all of his best music when he was younger and he became a train wreck when he was older, because guess what? That's equivalent to living in a cave and making more fire all the time. It's exactly the same story. And the only thing now is that the frequencies that we're using ruin the FM antenna and they degrade melanin on the inside. And see, you just got finished hearing that story, Abel, about the degradation of the melanin on the inside and the implications of what that causes. And it turns out you now are the silly talking monkey that gets to see all the other silly talking monkeys around you who are falling apart. Now, you may have the vision that Uncle Jack had 12 years ago when we first met, and why I was so concerned about all of you. Why? I didn't want you to become like the public has become now. They are being killed by heart disease and neurodegeneration at record rates, and it's happening much faster than anybody believes, while the addiction to technology, which is causing the problem, is actually rapidly increasing. Just think about from the time you and I first met and the use of technology in music alone, just to listen to music. Think about how it's changed just in those 12 years. That change is probably more rapid than what the change was around light in 1879 or 1893. So now you can see why Uncle Jack was a little concerned. Why Uncle Jack? Mouth is in a bakery. I don't think we have the time to bullshit around with this anymore, because we are rapidly falling apart, my friend. And if you think that eating a steak or eating a vegan diet or going carnivore is going to solve this non-visual photoreceptor problem that we really got, you are going to wind up in a coffin. And you're not going to participate. You are going to be this version of Steve Jobs. And I don't want that. I want guys like you, guys like Rick Rubin, guys like Jack Dorsey, my friends, my patients, to get this message out to people that we need to be smarter about the things they do. Make no illusions here. I'm not trying to tell you that you need to go completely away from technology. If we did, you and I wouldn't be talking now, probably 5,000 miles away, me at the top of the world and you like right in the middle of it, and having this update, after 12 years to discuss some of these things. But the sad part for me is you learned about me because of all the leptin stuff. You learned about me because of the cold thermogenesis stuff. But you left me before you actually had to ask me the question about melanin and what's the story. Why is that leptin melanocortin thing there? What I didn't never got that part, Jack. Tell me. Is that the part that's really important? Is that the part that we're kind of missing? Are we not paying attention to the whole story because we want to make sure Chris Kresser gets people to do labs on everybody that don't matter? That is really the crux of the issue. It's about getting the whole story, about swallowing the whole kahuna so that then we can come on your podcast and say, hey, let's talk about how these things that I put in my ear, I knew something was off about them, but I just didn't know what. And now you're kind of telling me what the what is. And you go back and go, what else am I doing right now that could actually be hurting me from being the music man that I want to be? What else could I do, Jack, that you helped, Rick with or Dorsey with or any of my farm members? What is it else that should be on my radar that's not? And it's not on my radar because I'm believing a bunch of bull that I shouldn't believe. What do we call that? We call that via negativa. Subtract the unnecessary. We have a word for that, superfluous. Think about the things that matter. Think about the things that we started this podcast with. The values in light, the values in temperature. Understand how those two simple little things control some of the most amazing things that create life in us. When you realize just how cool and how absurd nature is, you will sit back in your chair, fall back, open a bottle of wine, and go, holy smokes. I mean, this is the story of a lifetime. And this is a story that I want every single mammal who listens to this podcast I'm still, to this very day, I'm kid you not, 20 years later, I still haven't found a story that fascinates me more than this story, because it's the story of us. Like when I talk to you and have this update, and I think about what you've been doing, I'm thinking about, because I know you're probably like, dude, he talked to Rick Rubin, and you're a music guy. I want you to know that even Rick uses this stuff, and he doesn't have to know the science, but he is all in. When I tell you, dude, he is an all-in mammal, he is. He's that guy. He wants to question everything. And I never would have thought in a million years that it would have been the boomers or the older people that actually woke up quicker. Like, I'm still stunned about Jack Dorsey. But Dorsey, when I sat down with him, with my members at the Bitcoin Miami event, you know what he told me? He said, Jack, just keep doing what you're doing. He goes, everybody has told you you're wrong. He goes, keep doing what you're doing. Don't stop. And it actually resonated with me big time, because I haven't stopped anyway. I mean, when people tell me I'm wrong, just let's go, bro. Let's have it out. But the problem is, I don't think people are curious enough, Abel, for the truth anymore. I think they're just curious enough so that they can have their Netflix, their lattes, and live the life they want to live.
They want to know all of the truth right now and just have it be something that they can accept in the gestalt. But that's not how the truth works. And you're a seeker. You're willing to blow the paradigm up to find something that's a little bit closer to the whole truth. And I don't know why, but a lot of people in science, even some creatives, and certainly just kind of the average Joe and Jane, they're wired that way. They want the whole answer. They want to believe that that's the whole answer, and no one's going to make them budge after that. And that's only gotten worse since, in the decade since we've caught up. I mean, that's from a population level and just the way that people interact with each other now. It seems like that's gotten a lot worse. Maybe it's some of the censorship and shadow banning, and people see how anyone who sticks out from the crowd gets immediately ridiculed, or I don't know, they blew up my Instagram account 2 years ago. I'm not allowed to be on there. It's just like, and why? I don't know, because I ask questions. Isn't that how I built my career doing podcasting? It's like, that's not encouraged to the degree that it was when I was coming up in education. That was what education was for. And so we need people like you out there blowing up the paradigm and at least asking some questions. You're not saying I'm absolutely 110% correct about all of these things. You're simply asking questions and looking at pathways and trying to build a new,
do you remember,
more appropriate paradigm.
I know I'm interrupting you right now, but I'm going to tell you, do you remember the last time we did a podcast, you coined a term that I loved. I actually still use it to this day. You said, Jack, I think you're directionally accurate. Dude,
I heard you use that on the Rubin podcast.
Right. I will never forget that you're the one that coined that. So I want to give you credit right now, because I'll never forget when you said it. And I was like, that really resonated with me, because I can't tell you that everything I believe is 100% true, but I can tell you this, I'm a lot more accurate than the guys that are selling you food and exercise stories. That I know for sure. So I'm going to make fun of them all the time, all the way until somebody punches me in the mouth, until nature gets the right cross. Like somebody tells me that nature doesn't work the way she works, then I'll shut my pie hole. But I love the fact that you said that. And it's so crazy that 12 years later, it's still apropos.
Yeah, maybe even more so, because we don't, or the modern internet, social media doesn't like that wiggle room at all. It has to be one extreme or the other, and they need to just root down and believe that extreme, the carnivore or the vegan. There's nothing in between. And that's not how any of this actually works. But maybe I've heard you say a few other things that shocked me, especially about professional athletes these days. We see kids breaking down before they ever have before, earlier, getting disease and dysregulation, but also professional athletes aren't durable like they were before. When you grew up, and even when I was coming up, I remember athletes being built of steel, never falling apart. And that has completely changed in the past few years, especially.
Yeah, I mean, look at, I just did a podcast with another, they were two trainers, but I used the analogy, like when I was playing baseball, I mean, Nolan Ryan and Tom Seaver, they always struck out over 300 guys, but they pitched over 300 innings. You know, they were machines. Today, you have like guys like Jacob deGrom. He's been just an injury after an injury after injury. In the NBA, they're all talking about, well, we only should play 60 games. You know, and
That's
then you look at
ridiculous.
the NFL, you look at the NFL, like I follow a couple of teams. I'll give you an example that, right now is probably the biggest mismatch. Everybody is talking about how the Tennessee Titans are going to get buried. You know what everybody forgets? Last year, they were in first place. Their team got completely injured. They had to lose 7 straight games for the Jaguars to win that division. And without the injuries, they win the AFC South by 5 games. So NFL GMs now need to look at the redox state of the people they draft. And I've pointed this out. I've written blogs about, I'll give you the first guy, this because I'm thinking about the ones a long time ago. Kevin White, who was drafted, he was out of West Virginia, first-round receiver that the Bears took. I said, if you draft this kid and you draft him to a high-latitude team, you're going to have a problem. Second guy was Marshawn Lattimore for the Saints. He was top cornerback in his draft, but he missed a year in college because of soft tissue and hamstring injuries. And I'm like, he's basically telling you that his redox power is not good for the 40th latitude or above. So don't draft him. He was fortunate. He went to the Saints. So this year, I'm making a prediction. I've done it on another podcast, but I'm going to do it on yours. Kid from Ohio State, Jackson Enigma. He's a wide receiver. He went, I think, picked 21, 22, but he went to Seattle. He will not pan out. Mark my words. Why? He missed a full season, just like Lattimore did at Ohio State. So basically, what has he told us? He's not going to do too well at that high latitude. There's so many other people out there that have that issue in sports now, but nobody's putting the link together. And this is probably the final one, the sports stuff that I'll give you, because I think you'll dig this. If you look at the top 20 rushing list in the NFL, you'll notice that 19 out of 20, all these guys were from low latitude. Like you think about the top guy, Emmitt Smith, where does he come from? Pensacola, Florida. Where did he go to school? Florida. Okay? That's 28th latitude. Walter Payton, Jackson State, Mississippi, 30th latitude. The only guy on the list that breaks the rules is John Riggins. And do you know why he actually technically didn't break the risk? When he got drafted out of Kansas by the Jets, the first part of his career, he wasn't all that good because, he played with Namath. Later in his career, he becomes a wild man, goes to the Caribbean and starts dating all these women from the South and lives down there. Then he becomes the Tank. Okay? He becomes a monster later in his career. Nobody is put together because he spent almost all of his off seasons down in low latitude living. The story is there right in front of you. I told people the year that Adrian Peterson tore his ACL, he spent the whole year in Texas using red light to heal the ACL. He comes back and runs for 2,000 yards. Where'd he go to school? Oklahoma. Where is he from? Texas. So the story, even about light, my friend, is there, but it goes to what I was trying to tell you about your job and your profession with this music. Pay attention. The story is right there. It's still there. The circadian biology story is strong.
So just to connect the dots a little bit, being lower latitude allows people to intentionally or not spend a lot more time working out outside and getting exposure to the sun, whereas people who are up north are kind of trapped inside. Even if they're still pumping iron and doing sprints or what have you, they're not getting that fuel.
Yeah, I don't want anybody to work out indoors. Like if you're working out under blue light, you are absolutely doing exercise wrong. which is part of the reason why, I've been a huge fan of Irwin the Core from the
Yeah,
get-go.
me too.
This guy's the one guy that's gotten exercise right from day one. So I want people to not exercise under blue light, because what does blue light do? It makes you hypoxic. It's crazy to exercise in a gym this way. But the other big issue is that I want people to understand, what does technology do? Technology brings us inside too. And that's a big problem with technology. So I think the amount of outdoor time that we all get as silly talking monkeys now is not as good as it should be. And I think that we need to advocate for that far more than we probably do, like when we do our work, or you do podcasts and things like that.
Yeah, and just something anecdotally that I've noticed in nature is animals going out and dosing sun. Like, for example, I have a 11-year-old Labrador retriever who's trying to get in the door right now, and she goes out in the sun no matter where we live, multiple parts of the day, but usually as soon as she wakes up, wants to go right outside, lay down in the sunshine. It doesn't matter if it's 108 degrees in Austin or if we're up living in Colorado and it's below zero. This happens every day. She's been doing it for 11 plus years, and it's like clockwork. And so why is that so natural for animals to do, but not humans? Why can't we start to build this into our actual schedules and realize that it matters?
Well, Abel, the funny thing is, the fact that you're asking me this is exactly what I told you in the beginning of the podcast. I want you to go back and listen to your own podcast.
Okay.
Wild animals, dude, all their non-visual photoreceptors are completely attuned to nature, my friend. Remember, and I've told you this when I met you, we are the only mammal that uses these two things to break the laws of nature. This is our problem. Wild animals don't have the ability to do that. Like when you came out of your mother, you were just like the monkey. You were just like the alligator. You were just like the hippo. You didn't have clothes on. You didn't have sunscreen on. You didn't have sunglasses on. I mean, can you imagine if we saw Secretariat running on the track with sunglasses on? Or think about what some people are doing to their dogs now, putting blankets on them when they're outside. Like, what dog needs a blanket? Truthfully, what animal needs a blanket? Like, do the wolves in Yellowstone Park need, to have any type of blankets or heating devices around them? No, but they do it. Or the best one, my favorite one that I used back when you and I were in the same community, polar bears.
Yeah.
Polar bears go right in the water and they don't have a problem. Why? Because what do? They eat so much fish loaded with DHA, they reject the cold. The electric current that they have allows them. Everybody thinks, oh, it's their fur. Have you ever gone in to that Springs? What is it? Barton Springs down in Austin with your clothes on when it's windy out. Are you colder or warmer than if you were naked? You're going to find out that the cold coat actually makes you colder.
Right.
Okay. The wetness. Everybody thinks the fur keeps them. That's not even the answer. Turns out the higher electric charge from the DHA. Why is that the case? DHA has the electrons. You need the electrons to absorb light. Remember, that's the photoelectric effect. That's that non-parsimonious law that Richard Nicolay laughed at. Dude, that's the key. That's the reason why wild animals can do the they do. And it's also the reason why silly talking monkeys that do stuff they're not supposed to do, they get hammered. Our whole civilization, dude, is built on civilized, centralized ideas. I need people to get a little bit more rewild. Like, I want to see Abel play all of his stuff on acoustic guitars during the day with a bunch of people out there, the way it used to be. Like when I was young, we used to go to concerts during the day, dude. This whole nighttime thing, that started like in the 70s. That's not how it was in the 50s and 60s, just so you know that.
Yeah, well, I mean, even Dylan at Woodstock going electrified for the first time. It wasn't a good response from the crowd when this started to happen in the world of music. And obviously, it's only gotten worse and worse. One of the things that has changed in the past 5 or 10 years is that musicians went from listening with their ears on stage or throwing on cans like they did sometimes with the headphones. They switched from that to going to in-ears. And so probably not a whole lot different from the Apple AirPods situation. But anecdotally, a lot of my friends who work in music professionally say that a lot of problems started happening with ears when they made that switch. And it's something that they can't opt out of in a lot of cases, especially the bigger the touring act is. You have to have these in-ears going on. And so tinnitus is a big one. But what most of them said as well is that once you get used to a level that you can hear the other instruments that are pumped through those earbuds in your ears, you have to, or you have the tendency of turning it up. It's not enough volume over the course of time. It doesn't function the same way. So you have to keep turning it up to the point of hearing damage. And so that's a big problem in that industry. And I imagine a lot of others right now that doesn't seem to be being corrected in any way. It's only really getting worse, and more people are doing this.
Yeah, Rick actually made a really interesting point in his book. I don't know if you've read it, but you'll enjoy it. He actually reiterated to me when we were doing the podcast that the sound of a bass drum actually is above human frequency. And he goes, the reason it has a huge effect on people is that it still resonates because of the cavities that are inside us, but also water still responds to that, even though we can't hear that frequency.
You can feel it, not hear it, right? Yeah.
Right. And he said bass drums are ridiculously important because he made a comment to me when he and I met, I don't know, 10 or 15 years ago. We had lunch with, I think it was David Wolf. He was trying to convince David Wolf not to be vegan. And he made a comment about AC/DC and Metallica and how the bass drum was different. And I wanted to interrupt right there and explain to Rick why that was happening, because it was a Melanin effect. But of course, I didn't want to ruin the moment while Rick was schooling Wolf. Ultimately, it didn't work, obviously, but it's tied to the story that you just said about, the bass drum and the effect of melanin in the ear, that there's still effects of sound that are above our ability to actually hear them that still plays a role. And that study of physics that you would be interested in is actually the study called cymatics. And cymatics actually controls morphology and shape. And here's where the physics comes in. Turns out that sound waves are controlled mostly by magnetic fields, just so you know that. That was proven 2015 at Ohio State University. But the real big thing that people don't understand is that size and shape changes actually are a proxy for thermodynamic changes. This is why we see sound can have a huge effect on, mitochondrial fission and fusion, even in certain people. This is the reason why certain music actually plays, a healing role in some people, and why other music doesn't, especially when they have, non-visual photoreceptor damage. And I know you're a big guy into that stuff, about music and the brain and how it all works. So I think hopefully you learn a little bit more about how size and shape changes morphology and is tied to music, because I really do believe that music is healing. And I think the type of music that you really like actually is a proxy for your mitochondrial redox and your heteroplasmy rate. I actually believe there's information there that clinicians probably miss because they don't even realize that these relationships exist.
Yeah. Well, as you've mentioned in your work, music affects the coherence of water, and it affects the very cells in our body. Well, whether we're talking about very low frequencies or very high, we are sensing them kind of like light in a lot of ways, and they're affecting us whether we realize it or not. Otherwise, we wouldn't see music be so pervasive throughout our society. It's everywhere. The quality of it has degraded to the point that really bums me out sometimes. I'm surprised by that development in the past 5 or 10 years or so. But thankfully, there still are a lot of people who are audiophiles and go for the analog. They know that it matters. Listen on old school cans and old school headphones instead of the newfangled stuff. Frankly, I can't. One of the reasons I never really got into using Bluetooth is because it degrades the quality to my ears. It doesn't work. It doesn't do the same thing that when you look into cymatics, some of those things would be able to do. I bet if you set up some instrumentation, you would get different shapes from the different frequencies, even if it's the same song, because it's an approximation, a digital approximation of something that otherwise in an analog world is kind of coming from the natural world itself, or at least more so.
I totally agree. I mean, I hope that these things make some changes with some of the musicians that are out there. I know Rick really pays attention to that stuff. Like some of the, he refuses to put different things in and around his head. You know, I don't know if you saw the recent uh, thing he did on CNN with Anderson Cooper, and you could see Anderson Cooper's head explode when Rick said, "Look, I feel the music." And Anderson Cooper's like, people pay you millions of dollars, and that's actually what you want to give us the answer. And it was just so interesting to see that he could not understand that, because Anderson Cooper he's a machine for the centralized paradigm. And he just is so foreign to how Rick is a Zen master. He is totally decentralized, not only in his biology, but also in how he does his job. And I love that about him. I mean, that's part of the reason why he's one of my guys.
It's so cool. So what specifically, what did you tell him to do? Because like you said, he's not that interested in the science of how that works necessarily, but going out and walking 90 minutes in the morning, am I understanding that right? That's like pretty much every day.
Yeah, on the beach, I want him grounded all the time. And the other big thing, like post surgery that he had, is the use of methylene blue. The reason for that is it changes the oxidation state of the red blood cells in his body, and they keep it so that he doesn't degrade the melanin in his cochlea. Because that was the big risk when, you know, you have heart surgery and you have to go on bypass. Basically, your red blood cells are really, really at risk. And this is the reason why stroke is a risk, blood clots are a risk. I mean, it was the same thing that happened, you know, through COVID. People don't realize that the problem with smell and taste actually was due to melanin destruction at the ethmoid plate. That's the reason why it happened. And the thing is, methylene blue would have helped a lot of those people right then and there. But of course, you know, you couldn't even talk about ivermectin, never mind methylene blue. But, you know, that's the main driver of why it works. Plus, remember that he works in environments that are not idealized. So there's a benefit to him. Also, he suffers from the same affliction that I have, which is age. So we're already working on our 7th decade. And it turns out, if you know anything about quantum biology, you need more sunlight as you get older, not less. So in order to keep your red blood cells working perfect, because what is your red blood cell effectively? It's a wireless communication device that connects you from the sun to your mitochondria. That's really what it is. It is the wireless connection that you need to keep pristine and optimized. That was really the major issue. And the walking on the beach thing is a way for you to get free electrons, you know, as you walk. Why? Because we're the only mammal on the planet that has eccrine sweat glands in our feet and our hands. So you remember back in the day when I told people, eat like a great white shark but live like a polar bear, and then make like the Sphinx. The reason I said that is because when you ground, you get these free electrons. Electrons are how you capture light. So it was always about redox charge. But I said all these things without telling you the science. You know, I would come up with this, and you guys in the paleo community be like, you never asked me the questions you should have asked me. Why are you advocating this? Because then I think you would have begun to understand that this really was about increasing the net negative charge in your body. And that's effectively all the things that I've taught Rick, that I want him to focus in on increasing the net negative charge of his body and minimizing the positive charge. And, you know, most people know that is, you know, hydrogen protons. That's the pH scale. Most people understand pH and that stuff by log scale of protons. That's kind of like the world that Matt Lalonde and Rob Wolf used to operate on in the paleo community, but that's where they stopped. They never got to the next level, which is the level, you know, where light actually controls all this. Because to balance out the positive charge of a proton, you got to have an electron, and that electron can be excited by light, and you offset that light like a ferry boat to the proteins in your body. And, that's like the story of melanin. That's the story of melatonin. It's the story of serotonin. I mean, we could talk about all those different things, but I don't think that stuff for this podcast is really important. I just want your people to get a framework of kind of why I'm saying what I'm saying, so that when they listen to the Rubin podcast or they listen to this podcast, because I think this podcast is going to break down some of the things that we said in the Rubin podcast, and it'll make sense to people. And ultimately, you want it to make sense because you want to see people take some actionable points, from this and say, okay, what can I do? And I would tell you, grounding is one of the things you can do. Just make sure you ground in a correct place, that doesn't have underground power lines in it, or things that are not grounded so it affect you, and also for you to understand how to improve the charge in your body, to offset the choices that you have to make in your life, you being in the music business and me being a neurosurgeon.
So talking about electric current, plants have DC electric current, and there's a disconnect between the way that animal eaters and plant eaters think about this. Humans, I'm talking about here, and a lot of vegans and vegetarians, and I used to be way back in the day as well. I thought it was very noble because you're eating something that's not conscious, or at least it doesn't feel pain. Turns out that's not true. Animals and plants are more connected. Animals are driven by the sun, or plants are driven by the sun, certainly through photosynthesis. What about animals? Why wouldn't they be affected by it? Maybe you can just rant on that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, it's a ridiculous position that the vegans hold because neither one of them seem to know the basic work that was laid out in The Electric Body by Robert Becker. Becker talked about this. Now, remember, Becker's not the one that found the DC electric current in plants. You know who that was? That was a guy named Aaron Burr. Not Aaron Burr. Aaron Burr was a guy that got shot by Thomas Jefferson's guy, Alexander Hamilton. But his name was Burr. He was at Yale University. He's a researcher that's in Becker's book that he talked about. And that's actually how caterpillars, when they bite the leaf, the electric signal allows the plant to heal. That exact same signal is in every animal. So you may say plants aren't conscious, but they are absolutely conscious of what's going on in their environment. And they use this analog system to do it. So for someone to use the idea that being vegan is, somehow a more moral position is ludicrous from a quantum biologic perspective. Everything on this planet is predatory at one level. I mean, just think about evolution. We have extinction events. I tell people this all the time when I do podcasts. Not everybody's going to get my message, Abel, and I'm okay with that because that's how evolution works. If you want to continue and do the things, that David Wolf tells you to do, knock yourself out. But you're just not going to be part of my tribe, and I'm not going to focus in on you. I'm not going to try to change your position. It's kind of like when I listen to music. Like if I listen to the Stones, I'm going to turn it off because I hate the Stones. I just changed the channel.
Yeah.
No, there's a couple of Stone songs that I like. I'll leave them on for that. But ultimately, that band just doesn't resonate with my central nervous system. Well, vegans don't resonate with my beliefs in and around quantum biology. In fact, I think they're doing many things wrong, and I can sit down and have a cogent discussion with them. The first one being that we happen to have the most complex FM radio station in our head, and the circadian mechanism is based in and around the eye clock. That eye clock is in the retinal hypothalamic pathway. It has more DHA in it than any part of the human brain. Actually, and that's true in every mammal. Well, guess what? If you eat a vegan diet, you're never getting the amount in there. So what does that mean? You're walking around the planet with a supercosmatic nucleus that doesn't work well. And then I already told you one of the big stories, probably an hour and a half, hour and 45 minutes ago, that B12 is a photoreceptor in humans. Well, what do you know that vegans have a problem with? B12. Shocker. So if you're going to eat in a way that is not based around how your Ferrari engine up here works, because remember, The difference between us and Huberman cephalopods, this is version 1,150,000. Okay? You're not a cephalopod. You're not, a nematode. And you need to realize that. You need to be smart enough to understand that you have other needs and requirements in you, that eating a vegan diet or a vegetarian diet is not wise. Now, it doesn't mean you can't get away doing it for a long time. We saw that for 5,000 years, people in southern India were able to do it. But guess what? People in southern India used to be constantly outside, no non-native EMF, always in the sun, grounded. Now, in the last 25 years since Google and Facebook moved all their stuff over there, they have created the most diabetics in the world combined.
Wow.
Most people don't even know that.
Yeah.
180 million people have become diabetic in vegetarian India because we brought non-native EMF to their shores. Go figure that out.
So talking about quantum, there are a few quandaries for people, especially in mainstream centralized medicine. When you tell a few of the stories that I'd love to hear once more on this show, specifically about the heart transplant and McDonald's French fries. You have a few anecdotes like that are absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, well, I've got a lot of them. I just decided to drop that one in that podcast because I have to tell you that for me as a neurosurgeon put me in a state of disbelief. And that's when I realized that there had to be an explanation behind it. To be honest with you, I'm very interested in the explanation. And what I was trying to get across to Huberman at that time with, the heart transplant is that realize that our organs are imprinted by energies and information that happen in our life. And even when we transplant them into another body, those things persist. So like when people go to a funeral and cry, don't cry, because it turns out that person really still is alive. Their energy is still out there. It's just in such a random form that you don't see it. And it turns out because this kid was imprinted by his death, this lady had an intense need for McDonald's French fries, and this is something that she never ate, and she couldn't figure out why. And when she came to me, because she knew that I was the neurosurgeon that pronounced the kid brain dead, that was about the only thing the hospital would tell her. She didn't know anything else about the kid. I was stunned when I heard the story because I actually knew how the kid died, because he came to me from the drive-thru after he got T-boned. And I didn't know how to answer her. Like, I had to look for the mechanism myself. I said, just like I said to you in the podcast, there's no coincidences in nature. Things happen for a reason, and it's our job. Instead of just, saying, oh, it's this or that. I wanted to know what it was. And it didn't dawn on me until probably about 2009 when Luc Montagnier did some of the work that he did around water. Because, everybody thought Montagnier was crazy after he got the Nobel Prize for finding the AIDS vaccine, or I should say the AIDS virus. He started to do some really cool things around water. Why? Because one of his centralized friends got canceled by centralized science who worked in water. And his name was Jakes Benevisti. And Benevisti basically got outed by the guys at Nature. They basically tried to say he was a quack. And what Benevisti found in his research was the basis of why what I saw about this heart transplant and this recipient happened. And it turned out that we imprint our life energies on water. And what happens when light hits water? Water gets more coherent domains. What does that mean in English? Because I don't want to talk over your listeners. It means you have more electrons in certain parts of the water network in there. And when you have more electrons in that part, that means it absorbs more light. So I've already told you in the Huberman podcast that we create light endogenously. So what I think happened at the time with the kid is that he knew that this was a big event in his life. He released massive amounts of light to the water that was actually in the heart. When he went on to brain death, this stayed there in holographic way, just the way a magnetic tape drive works in a computer. And when the organ was harvested by the trauma surgeon, some of the data clearly was lost, but not all of it was lost. Even though the tissue is disconnected from the host, the information was recoverable by the recipient. And the way in which I think it was recovered by the recipient was through the transfer of water from his body and her body. And do I believe that the system fundamentally that happened was what I said to you earlier, that FM radio station in our brain between the suprachiasmatic nucleus and the thalamus is all a water network. The CSF is 100% water. So do I believe that she was sampling some of that in this antenna and she was picking it up? It's kind of like, you know how like when you're in a radio station and you pick up a radio station in between and you go, wow, I just heard somebody talking, somewhere else. I mean, you've probably seen movies like that. We see that there, but we don't accept it in the story that, I shared with Huberman and Rick. But it's exactly the same mechanism. The physics is well known. The problem is it just stuns our centralized belief paradigms that things like this can happen. So it gives you, I think, a different take on how you look at kids, because I think your kid is kind of like an organ transplant. I actually think love, I think sex is the same way. I think when you think about sex when you use protection and sex when you don't is also very similar to this story. I actually don't believe you can have good sex when you're using protection because there's not a proper light transfer going on.
It cuts off the electromagnetics as well, right?
Absolutely. There's no question. I mean, remember, rubber is an insulator, and we don't even think about that, because we're focusing on, okay, well, you don't want to have a baby. I mean, forget about talking about, birth control pills and all that other stuff. That's even a bigger electromagnetic problem. But the point is, I think this resonates in that story when you realize fundamentally what water is doing. Because remember, I always told you it comes down to light, water, magnetism. Water is how you imprint the electromagnetic environment into your cell. And then many other things happen to that so that you can decipher the message. I think when you think about it from that framework, the story becomes less sensational and it becomes actually more, not only scientific, but I think it becomes more curious, because then you start to think about how things are transferred in the world. Think about wild animals, like how dogs will pee on a fire hydrant and then all the dogs keep peeing on the fire hydrant. What they're doing is the exact same thing. The electromagnetic energy to that dog is in his pee. And animals do this all the time, but we don't think we can. Well, I got bad news for everybody listening to this. You're a f***ing animal, okay? You're a very specialized mammal that can do things just like they can. And you need to pay attention to that stuff.
Let's talk a little bit more about water and specifically why you don't want certain things in it, like fluoride, for example, and how iodine plays in this as well. I want to make sure we cover that a little bit.
Yeah, fluoride is a simple one. Fluoride is the most electronegative atom on the periodic table. So what does that do? What does it mean? Steals electrons. So if you steal electrons from water, based on what we just said, should be no shocker why you never want to use fluoride. Why? Because it means that your water has lost the ability to imprint light, information, and energy in it. Therefore, there's not going to be good information transfer in your body. That's the fundamental reason why. What else does it do? It's what I told Huberman, is that this was on a Twitter feed, that fluoride also makes you hypoxic. So it actually creates less water in your mitochondria. So anything that makes you hypoxic changes cytochrome 1. That's where NAD positive and NADH cycle. So what does that mean? It means the engines in the mitochondria don't work as good. So think about your car. If somebody was to pour maple syrup into your carburetor, do you think your car would work as good? The answer is no. You actually need more oxygen. So those are all the reasons why fluoride really are bad. Iodine happens to be a halogen, but the atomic mass of iodine is massive, much, much different. So it acts as a much different halogen than fluoride. It's not as electronegative, and it turns out it has another unique ability. It brings protons closer together. It's called the Grothaus mechanism. And we just talked about how CSF in your body is created as an ultrafiltrate from blood. Turns out the choroid plexus that makes CSF also enriches the CSF with iodine so that you can also bring more proton conduction in water in your brain, which is something else we use, not something that I really talked about in the Huberman podcast. But what other tissues in the body do you know that iodine's used? Thyroid gland is a big one. Thyroid links directly to the melanin story because of that slide I told you before. T3 and T4 can be made directly from melanin if you degrade it. So this is the reason why I always told people, even if you had your thyroid cut out, there's still hope for you if you understand how this process works. And the other big tissue that it's in is in breasts, especially human breast for women. Most women that have fibrocystic disease in their breast where you can't even touch them, it's because they're iodine deficient. We commonly see it today in women who are vegan or vegetarian. I famously always tell the story when I was in medical school. I think I was a third-year medical student, and ladies used to come in and volunteer to have exams done because they get paid to do that. And the lady that I had the day we were doing the breast exam had massive breasts. And she told the doctor, he was an 80-year-old doctor at the time, because he was retired. And he said, I got a trick that will work to help you be able to tolerate 4 students, learning how to do a breast exam. So he asked us to step out of the room, and he came back in, and like 15 minutes later, we were all able to fondle this woman with no problems, learn how to do a breast exam properly. And I pulled him aside. I'm like, dude, what did you do in that 15 or 20 minutes? He goes, well, I just went in and I put Lugol solution right on her nipple, and we just left it on there for 15 or 20 minutes. And he goes, I talked to her, and she said that she, had problems eating fish or was allergic at some level or food intolerant. And he goes, I knew that was the problem, so I did that. And I just looked at him and I'm like, dude, that's like ancient wisdom. Why aren't you teaching us like that?
Yeah.
And I never forgot the lesson. So that when women come up to me now and I do consults, I tell them about this. I'm like, look, you need more seaweed, you need more marine shellfish in your life. I even tell them to make the seafood broths out of the chitin that's on, shrimps or lobsters or crawfish, things like that. But you can also use Lugols to do it. The problem is Lugols can be really toxic for women's either vaginal mucosa or their breasts, because believe it or not, this also helps sexual health for women as well, especially as they get older. And those are the kind of things that you pick up, when you're paying attention down the road. So the Grothaus mechanism is important for how apocrine glands work, how your brain works, how CSF works, and really how your thyroid works. And these are quantum mechanical principles. The reason why bringing protons together matters, it means that they can entangle much more easily. The further they are apart from an angstrom basis means it's much more difficult to undergo quantum entanglement. And entanglement, we now know, is a process that happens in mammals and even in birds. We're finding a lot more about that. And the reason why it's the most important thing, I think you're going to find out in the next 10 years that this is actually how DNA functionally works. You change proton tunneling on the base pairs, and this is actually what causes changes in the DNA code. It's not the way Watson and Crick said it happened, although I will give Watson and Crick some credit. They were the people in their original paper, in 53, that made the comment that DNA seemed to be an electromagnetic antenna that probably worked through some process of proton tunneling. That was lost by most people when they read the paper, especially in centralized science. But we now know a pretty famous biophysicist named Jim Al-Khalili at the University of Surrey is now doing experiments the last 5 years to actually prove that. He's doing it with John Joy McFadden. And we now know that actually happens. There's multiple papers in the literature that prove that this is not a pipe dream. It actually this is how biology really works.
It's fascinating. I want to make sure we talk about as well the Sherpas and their strength and the relation to hypertrophy and the obsession with Westerners and having big muscles and being strong that way. When in fact, I remember back in college, my friends and I kind of like noticed that effect. We called it old man strength. When you see this like skinny old man who can outlift the power lifter who's in college, it's like, what is that? Maybe you can explain a bit.
Well, you remember, I know you remember, I talked about this even back in the early paleo days, because remember, most of them were meatheads and they all thought that big muscles were a huge issue. And if you remember back then in the Cold Thermogenesis series, I talked to you about Sherpas and I talked to you about Vasper machines and why NASA was doing this. This is part of the reason NASA came to talk to me 15 years ago. I explained to people that when you use UV light and cold together, you create a superhuman pathway in humans. And that was the basis of what CT4 and CT6 blogs were about. And I still, to this very day, don't think people get it. So the latest iteration of idiots that I'm making fun of about this issue is Peter Attia, who just released his new book. And, he's good friends with Rick. He's good friends with Huberman. But, I go off on him. And what's the point? I'll explain this to you as simply as I can, Abel, and then maybe you'll understand where I'm coming from. Sherpas, generally, they weigh probably 130 to 170 pounds. They can pick up 4 times their body weight. They're the guys that bring people up to Everest. When they live at their base camp at around 15 to 20,000 feet, they eat carbohydrates, they eat lentils, they eat rice. But when they climb up the mountain, when they're getting closer to UV light, when they're in freezing cold, they eat nothing but saturated fat. They eat butter, okay? They're able to function. In fact, we're doing this podcast. I just saw about 6 weeks ago that a Sherpa carried a Northern European off the mountain who was dying. Think about that. Carrying another human being down from 29,000 feet to 15,000 feet at base camp and having the ability to do this is much more impressive than some jerk off picking up 450 pounds in a blue lit gym. But why does this make sense? Let me explain this. Humans buried our mitochondrial capacity here in our hearts, okay? Not in our muscles. Chimps and monkeys and gorillas buried it in those areas. Why does this make sense? Everybody knows about Cleaver's law. It's a mammalian scaling law. Where you bury your mitochondria really matters. So I told you way back when about Doug Wallace's work that every year we lose 10% mitochondrial efficiency. That's called heteroplasmy. That's what natural aging is all about. So does it make any sense to you when you realize that energy is a zero-sum game, that you're going to hypertrophy in part of your tissues that don't have mitochondrial capacity, excess mitochondrial capacity as you age? Don't you think that that's going to create an energy steal syndrome between your heart and your brain? Could this be the reason why my friend, and I know someone Charles Poliquin, died? The answer is yes. That's part of the reason why I kept telling him, you're going to have a problem, because there's a huge, huge issue. We now have Peter going out and the New York Times bestseller, people pay me $100,000 a year to be their doctor. This guy's a smart guy. Don't get me wrong. I think he's a smart guy. But do I think he's thought about this from the decentralized perspective and not the centralized one? No. In fact, he posted probably in the last 2 months the other day when he got into a heavy zone, his nose started bleeding. Does anybody think that it's normal to go through a workout when your nose bleeds? I mean, based on some of the things that me and Abel have already talked about, about how important your blood is and why I told Rick to use methylene blue to maximize his red blood cells. Remember, this is the doctor that told Rick he was crazy to listen to me, okay? So if you hypertrophy your muscles as you get older, you're actually creating a steal syndrome from your brain and your heart. So you don't want to do that. This is the reason why you don't see any 90-year-olds look like Michelangelo's David. And it's the point that I made in the Huberman podcast, that the guy who's been studying supercentenarians the most, which is Nir Barzilai, who actually, Peter Attia does a good job parsing out that science. These are short, little, fat Jewish guys that don't have big muscles, that leptin levels are around 30. But but they all have some type of change that happened later in their life where they inactivate the IGF-1 gene, meaning through proton tunneling, they actually turn off the ability to get big muscles. You think a guy like Peter Attia would have said, hey, this is kind of important. But what is he doing instead? He's a New York Times bestseller for selling you the idea that having big muscles is going to lead to longevity. And I'm the guy that's telling you this is absolutely wrong. I mean, it's so dead wrong because he does not have a thermodynamic understanding of how energy flows inside cells. Why? Because his belief system is very much based on what, Rob Wolf and Matt Lalonde were pushing in the paleo community multiple years ago. And I know Abel knows that those guys also were really big believers in lifting heavy weights and doing things like that. I'm a big believer in lifting heavy weights, but doing it outside the way Erwin McCord does it, in nature, doing rocks and things like that. I'm not a big fan of doing some of the powerlifting stuff that, Rob and Matt and Peter are pushing. And I just want people to understand the reason why. I don't want people to think that this is something that I'm trying to actively go against them. No, there's an actual medical reason. I think I understand Kleber's law better than they do, and I certainly understand quantum biology better than all three of them combined. And I think my goal as a physician is to do no harm. And when I see another physician potentially putting people at harm, I have a duty to speak up. It's not being unprofessional, in my opinion, to have a difference of opinion with another colleague. And I think it's fair. I wish we would have done this during COVID, but I want people to understand why my difference of opinion exists so that then you can vet it appropriately and then decide how it goes. And I appreciate, Abel, you asking me this question on this podcast, because hopefully, people will then begin to understand my perspective a little bit, better.
Well, it's so important. And I think you are a great example to a lot of people out there who are just a little too sheepish to ever disagree with anyone, especially upstanding citizens and scientists and well-respected peers or coaches, teachers, whoever they might be. It's very important to try to figure this out together. And we're not going to do that if we all pretend to agree.
I just want to tell people, in case they don't know, there's a 7-hour time difference between me and Abel right now. So for him, it's still early in the morning. For me, it's, I believe, close to 7:30. And don't worry, the light's not going to go out where I am because I'm at the 63rd latitude. So it stays on until about 11:30.
Right on. So Dr. Kruse, Uncle Jack, what is the best place to find your work before we go?
Just put Dr. Jack Kruse into just about any social media platform and you'll find me. If you want to get the daily lessons, read Twitter. You want to read 10 years worth of my work, just go to my website, my forums. It's all there for free. If you want the cutting edge stuff, it costs $5 a month. The cost of a cup of coffee. That's on Patreon, patreon.com, Dr. Jack Kruse. If you want to read about how I got introduced to Abel, you can actually read the book that Mark Sisson didn't like. It's out there on Amazon. It was written in 2013. I met Abel in 2011. It took 2 years after the rejection of Mark for me just to decide to self-publish and say, look, I already wrote it, so why not just give it to the world and let's see what they say. I've got a lot of old blogs on. Right? Yeah, I got a lot of old blogs on the Jack Kruse website that are free. I've got, I think, close to 200 free blogs on LinkedIn. You want to follow me on Instagram? I'm kind of like, I put all my quotes there. Sometimes I put lessons, but most of the time it's quotes. But the bottom line is, you can find me anywhere. If you decide you want more of me, then you can sign up and be a full member. Or if you really want a lot of me, it's expensive, but you can hire me as your doctor. That's kind of what I'm doing. Tomorrow I'm going to see one of my patients in Norway. So don't think that I won't go and find you if I need to come find you.
Right on. Dr. Jack Kruse, thank you so much for being so generous with your time and attention and knowledge here today. Really appreciate it. Look
All
forward
right,
to next
Abel, it was great talking to you too, man. It really was. We need to do this more than every 12 years.
I agree. Let's do it again soon. Thanks again, Jack.
All right, take care.
Hey there, thanks so much for joining us on this episode of the Fat Burning Man Show. Before you go, please hit like and subscribe, or even better, leave us a quick review, which helps other people find their way to this free show. We've recorded over 400 episodes of this award-winning show over the past decade and change, and you can watch every single episode for free at fatburningman.com. So if you can think of a friend or a family member who might enjoy and benefit from our work, please take a quick second to share it with someone you care about. Thank you so much for all of your reviews, comments, likes, emails, and the kind words you send our way. We couldn't do any of this without you. Now, a quick disclaimer. The Fat Burning Man Show provides general information and discussions about health and related subjects and is not intended as medical advice, nor is the information a substitute for professional medical expertise, diagnosis, or treatment. If you or any other person has a medical concern, I wholeheartedly encourage you to consult with your healthcare provider. Now, before I sign off, don't forget to join our newsletter at fatburningman.com. When you sign up with your email, I'll send you a wild quick start guide along with a few of our ridiculously tasty recipes. This is Abel James signing off. Thanks so much for listening and have a great week.